The old wall clock kept ticking as my son leaned in and said, "You owe us everything." Still staring at the chipped teacup between my fingers, I nodded once, like a mother should. As each tick echoed louder, it stopped sounding like time and started sounding like sacrifice. While he paced the room, waiting for regret, I let the silence thicken, like spoiled tradition. The same silence I fed him with for years, trading love for usefulness. That's when I smiled and said, "You're right," then signed the will without his name on it. Before we begin, may I ask, where in this big, beautiful world are you listening from? It's always a quiet honor to know who's sharing this space. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Dinner at Emily's was always tight, the air thick with things left unsaid. The roast chicken smelled rich, but it was Vivian's sweet potato casserole that filled the room, sitting untouched in the center of the table. The marshmallows, browned to perfection, stared back at her as if they too were waiting for something. Vivian forced a smile as she set the casserole down, glancing over at the family, the familiar tightness in her chest settling in. Stephen, sitting at the head of the table, was picking at his food, not really eating, his mind elsewhere. He sighed heavily, shaking his head. "Work's just too much," he muttered. "Deadlines, constant pressure, and the bills. God, I can't keep up." Vivian glanced at him, her hands resting on her lap. She hadn't touched her own food either. "Maybe we need to cut back on some things," she said quietly. "I've been thinking about the will. Things are getting tight." There was a brief pause. Stephen scoffed, a bitter laugh escaping him. "The will?" He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Vivian, you owe us everything you have. Don't pretend it's a burden." Emily, sitting across from him, gave a nervous laugh. "He's joking," she said quickly, trying to brush the comment aside. But she didn't correct him, didn't soften the edges of the moment. Her eyes flickered uncomfortably between Stephen and Vivian. Vivian's smile tightened, but she said nothing. She knew better than to argue. Instead, she picked up her fork, cutting a small piece of chicken. It wasn't about the food anymore. It hadn't been for years. It was about the silence, the things they never said, but always felt. Stephen continued, his voice more biting now. "You don't get it, Mom. We've been trying to help you, but you've been acting like you're the one who's got it all under control. You think we don't know?" Vivian blinked, trying to control the knot in her throat. "I've been trying," she whispered. "Trying to make everything work." He didn't look at her. "You've been hiding it from us," he said, his tone cutting through the air. "We've all felt it." The words hit her like a slap, sharp and unexpected. She had tried so hard to protect them from the burden of the life she had lived. But now it felt like the weight of all those years was crushing her. Emily shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Her eyes, once full of distraction, were now full of something else. Regret, maybe, or just confusion. She avoided Vivian's gaze, staring down at her plate, as though it could answer all the questions that had been rising between them. Vivian's breath caught. "You don't know what it's like," she said, barely above a whisper, "to carry all of this alone, to keep it from you." Stephen finally met her eyes, his expression hard. "We've always known," he said flatly, "and we're tired of pretending we don't." The room went quiet, the weight of his words settling in the space between them. The casserole sat untouched, a symbol of everything they had failed to confront, everything they had failed to understand. Vivian's hand trembled slightly as she placed her fork down. She had always been the one to hold everything together, to keep them all afloat. But in that moment, it felt like all the years of doing so had been for nothing. The promises, the sacrifices, the debts, none of it had made a difference. "I never asked for this," she said, the words leaving her mouth before she could stop them. None of this. There was no response, just the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the background. Stephen's gaze shifted from her to Emily, who had finally met her eyes, but there was no clarity there. No answers, only more silence. The air between them grew heavy, thick with things unsaid. The casserole, once a symbol of family tradition, now felt like a weight too heavy to bear. Vivian's chest tightened, her mind racing, but she stayed still, unable to move, unable to change what had been said. Stephen stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "We're done here," he muttered, his voice cold. "I can't do this anymore." And with that, he left the table, the door slamming behind him, leaving only the quiet behind. Vivian sat there, staring at the empty space where he had been. The words she'd been holding in for so long now felt like a tidal wave, overwhelming and unstoppable. But it was too late. And as Emily silently pushed her plate aside, she stood, not meeting her mother's eyes, and followed Stephen out. The casserole sat in the center of the table, still untouched. Vivian was alone. The low hum of the lamp was the only sound in the room. Vivian sat at her desk, surrounded by old documents, the weight of the past pressing down on her. She sifted through them methodically, her fingers tracing the edges of papers yellowed with age. The mortgage papers, the ones she had paid off herself, stared back at her. She'd done it all, every cent, every bill, every late-night payment. Jack had promised to carry the load, but he hadn't been there in the end. Her gaze shifted to the old salary slips, proof of her endless hours and sacrifices. No one had ever said thank you. Not Stephen, not Emily. The burial costs, nothing. Not even a phone call to ask how she was holding up. Her hands trembled slightly as she set the slips aside, eyes moving across the room. All this work, this effort, had led to nothing. They had taken from her time, her love, her strength, without giving back. But what did she expect? Stephen had always been the entitled one, never seeing her struggles. And Emily, always the quiet observer, had never stepped forward either. Vivian had hoped once, a long time ago, that after Jack's death, they'd see her, really see her. But the years had passed, and all she had was silence. The doorbell rang, dragging her from the fog of old memories. She moved slowly, almost mechanically, to the door. When she opened it, Carol stood there, her face soft with understanding. "I thought I'd stop by," Carol said, her voice low. "Mind if I come in?" Vivian stepped aside and let her in, the heaviness of her own thoughts still lingering in the air. She offered Carol a cup of tea, and they settled at the table, the silence between them comfortable but thick with the unspoken. After a few moments, Carol broke the quiet. "You know," she said, her voice softer now, "you were the engine. They were just passengers." Vivian's eyes narrowed, her fingers curling slightly around her teacup. "I just never charged for gas," she muttered, the bitterness evident in her tone. Carol nodded, her gaze steady. "You gave everything, Viv. You always did. But you can't keep running on empty." Vivian's chest tightened, the truth of Carol's words sinking in like a weight. She had been the one keeping everything together, never asking for help, and in the end, it had cost her. I thought they'd understand. I thought they'd see." "They never did," Carol said gently. "And you didn't make them." Vivian sat back, her mind racing. How had she never seen it? All the years spent giving and giving, expecting something in return. But there had been no return, no acknowledgement, no gratitude, just more demands, more expectations. She stood up, walking slowly to the nearby shelf, where she kept a new notebook. She opened it, the blank pages staring back at her like a fresh start, the old lists, filled with debts, sacrifices, promises, hadn't worked. It was time to start anew. As she picked up the pen, the first words came to her easily, almost painfully. What they expect, my time, my energy, my love. She hesitated before writing the second line. What they deserve, nothing. The words felt sharp, strange at first, like a betrayal to the woman she had been. But the more she wrote, the clearer it became. She wasn't doing this for them. She wasn't doing this to hurt anyone. She was doing this to protect herself. The knock at the door startled her, and she looked up to find Henry standing in the doorway, his expression steady, his presence like a grounding force. He didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room before settling on Vivian. "You ready to stop writing checks to people who already spent your love?" he asked, his voice low and measured. Vivian's heart skipped a beat at his words. She looked down at the notebook in her hands, the weight of the question sinking in. It wasn't just about money, about the things she had given. It was about everything, her time, her energy, her soul. and how much she had given without ever receiving anything in return. Henry's eyes softened, but his expression remained firm. "You don't owe them anything," he said, his voice thick with meaning. Vivian swallowed hard. For the first time in years, she felt something stir within her, a flicker of defiance. She wasn't the same woman she had been when Jack died. She didn't have to keep giving. The notebook in her hands felt heavier now, like a tool she could finally use for herself. She was done with giving everything and getting nothing. The door had opened, and it was time to step through it. The kitchen was quiet, the kind of quiet that only comes with long-held tension. The overhead light cast a warm glow over the worn countertop, its yellow hue almost comforting, but not enough to soften the unease in the air. Vivian stood near the sink, her hands busy with dishes that had been left untouched for hours, the act of cleaning something she could control. She kept her back to the door, waiting for Stephen to speak, knowing he would. The chair scraped against the floor as he sat down at the kitchen table. She didn't need to turn around to know he was there. She could feel his presence, thick and demanding, like it always was. "It's just temporary," Stephen said, his voice flat, as though rehearsed. "You know you'll always take care of us. That's how it's always been." Vivian didn't flinch. She didn't acknowledge him with a glance or a word. The dishes clinked softly as she set them into the drying rack. The rhythm of her movements was deliberate, almost mechanical. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, almost too calm. "Define us," she said. Stephen shifted in his seat, a small laugh escaping him, though it didn't reach his eyes. "What do you mean, define us? You always say family first." Vivian paused, her hand frozen midair as she placed a plate on the counter. She set it down with an effort, but when she finally turned to face him, there was no softness left in her gaze, no mercy, only a quiet, unyielding strength. "I do," she said, her voice still even, but it carried weight. "And I'm family too." For a moment, the room was silent. Stephen blinked, his brow furrowing as he tried to process her words, tried to find some way to fit them into the familiar narrative he had built in his mind. He had always been able to make her the villain, to justify the ways he had asked and taken, but not this time. This time, she was something different. He laughed again, though it was brittle this time, edging into frustration. "What's your point, Mom? You've always been the one to bail us out. Don't act like it's any different now." Vivian's chest tightened, but she didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She had learned that words could only carry so much weight. Action, though. Action spoke louder than any syllable could. She took a step away from the counter, her eyes locked onto Stephen. Her breath was steady, controlled. "I'm not bailing anyone out anymore, Stephen." His mouth opened, but no words came out at first. Then his expression twisted, a mix of confusion and anger. "You can't just stop, Mom. You're the one who—" She didn't let him finish. She stood up, turning toward the door. The movement was slow, deliberate, but it held a finality he had never heard in her voice before. It was as if she were closing a door that had been open for far too long, one she had held ajar for years without realizing how much it had drained her. Stephen stood up abruptly, his chair scraping across the floor with an angry screech. He took a step toward her, eyes wide, mouth moving as if he were trying to form the right words, but none came. He was lost, and she wasn't giving him any more space to find himself. "Mom, come on," he said, his voice rising in frustration. "Don't do this." Vivian didn't answer. She didn't need to. She just looked at him once, the quiet understanding of her resolve settling in between them like a silent wall. He had always thought he could rely on her, that she would always be there to catch him, but that was over. She turned to walk out of the room, her footsteps slow, unhurried. As she reached the door, she heard Stephen mutter something under his breath, probably a curse or a complaint. But she didn't turn back. Stephen stood in the middle of the kitchen, his hands clenched at his sides, the weight of his unspoken words hanging heavily in the air. There was no money to exchange, no promises to be made. She was done. The door clicked softly behind her, leaving him alone in the room with nothing but his own frustration. The silence that followed felt deafening, as though the kitchen itself was holding its breath, waiting for something that would never come. Vivian sat at the desk in her dimly lit study, the same space where she had once pored over mortgage papers and tax forms. But tonight, the weight of the documents before her felt different. There was no longer any sense of obligation, no more urgency in her motions. She could feel the cool weight of the pen in her hand as it hovered over the legal paper, poised to rewrite her future, a future without them. She had made the decision months ago, but now, as she signed the final page, it was real. No going back. Stephen and Emily were no longer primary heirs. The ink bled into the paper, the sharp strokes of her pen marking the beginning of something new. Her hand hovered again. The words she was about to write solidifying everything she'd been building toward. Rachel, the girl who had stepped in when no one else did. The one who had helped her at the food bank. The one who had listened when she needed someone to talk to. She'd been there, quietly, steadfastly, when her own children couldn't be bothered. Rachel would inherit. And 2 charities, ones she had quietly volunteered for over the years, ones that had kept her grounded when everything else felt lost, would also receive part of the estate. They had given her more than she had ever asked for. They had given her purpose when her own children had only taken. She added a final note to the will, her handwriting steady as she wrote, "Love should never have to be paid back." The words were a relief to write. Like the final exhale after holding her breath for far too long, they were the truth. It had been a one-sided exchange for too long. Now she could finally give something back, not to those who had only taken, but to the ones who had given her the space to breathe. She signed the last page and sealed the envelope with a finality that made her chest feel lighter. Henry had been there from the start, and now he was the one who would file and seal the will. He had seen her struggle and had always respected her decisions. As he took the documents from her, his eyes softened. "It's done, Viv. You've done what you needed to." She nodded, her voice low. "I just hope they never find out." He paused, his hand on the door frame. "Do you feel guilty?" Vivian's lips curled into a faint smile. There was no hesitation in her answer. "I feel clean." The days passed in a blur of tasks and small victories, silent battles won in her mind. She was in control now. The house felt quieter, emptier, but she didn't mind. She had learned to live with the silence. And then, one evening, as the night settled in, her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. A message, a group text from Emily. "Mom, family meeting Sunday. Don't skip it." Vivian stared at the words on the screen for a long moment. The silence in the room seemed to stretch out, heavier now, as if the weight of the message had settled into every corner of the house. She didn't know what was worse, the demand to show up or the reality that she no longer cared what they expected of her. A part of her wanted to ignore it, to let them wonder, to let them feel the absence she had been living with for so long. But there was something inside her that knew this wasn't over. It couldn't be. Her fingers hovered over the phone, and then she placed it face down on the counter, turning away. There was no need for an answer, not yet. The door had closed, but the next chapter was only just beginning. The knock on the door was soft, but it carried a weight that seemed to reverberate through the silence of the house. Vivian looked up from the window where she had been staring out, lost in thought. She had heard no footsteps in the hallway, only the quiet hum of her own mind. She wasn't expecting anyone, but as she opened the door, there was Rachel, standing on the threshold, holding a thermos of coffee and a small notebook in her hands. "Hey, Grandma," Rachel said, her voice warm but steady, as if she already knew what kind of day it had been. "I brought coffee. Thought we could talk." Vivian stepped aside, the old wooden floor creaking under her feet as Rachel walked in. The faint scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, mingling with the sun-dappled warmth that filtered through the sunroom windows. Rachel settled on the worn couch, placing the thermos on the table before opening the notebook and flipping it open with deliberate care. "Tell me about Grandpa," Rachel said softly, her eyes meeting Vivian's with an understanding that made Vivian's heart catch. It was the first time in ages someone had asked about Jack. Someone had asked to listen. Vivian hesitated for a moment, the memories swirling in her mind, but the warmth in Rachel's gaze coaxed the words out. Slowly, she sat down beside her granddaughter, her hands folding in her lap. The stories began to spill, Stories of Jack's laugh, his gentle teasing, the way he would sit with her in the evenings, talking about the world. Stories no one else had asked to hear. Stories she had kept to herself for so long, tucked away in the corners of her heart. Rachel listened intently, her eyes wide with curiosity, her pencil occasionally scratching against the paper as she jotted down notes. There was no judgment in her gaze, no expectation. Just a quiet presence that made Vivian feel heard, seen. When she finished, there was a long silence between them. Rachel leaned forward slightly, her voice low but firm. "I know how they treat you," she said. "I've seen it. I've watched the way they've never cared. Not like they should." Vivian felt a lump form in her throat. She hadn't said it aloud before, not like this. Not to anyone who truly understood. Her eyes welled up, the tears spilling over despite herself. She quickly wiped them away, but Rachel was already there, her hand gently resting on her grandmother's. "That's more than they've ever said," Vivian murmured, her voice cracking with emotion. "No one else has ever said it like that." Rachel didn't say anything. She just nodded, her eyes soft with understanding, the silence between them saying more than words ever could. Vivian felt an overwhelming sense of relief wash over her. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of her sorrow, of everything she had kept inside, lighten, if only a little. After a while, they moved to the kitchen, the sound of chopping vegetables and the hum of the stove filling the space between them. Rachel worked with a quiet focus, washing every dish, every utensil, without complaint. Vivian couldn't help but watch her, a feeling of awe settling in her chest. This was the way it should have been, the way it always could have been. But it hadn't been. As they finished dinner, Vivian stepped away, her fingers brushing the pages of the will she had prepared. She had already made the changes, but there was one thing left to add, a note. She took the pen, her hand steady as she wrote a single line. "This is why." The words felt like the final piece of a puzzle, something that tied everything together. It was her truth, written in ink, sealed and unmovable. She would leave it all behind, the bitterness, the frustration, the years of giving without receiving. Rachel was the one who had seen, who had understood, who had given without asking for anything in return. Vivian set the pen down and took a deep breath, feeling something in her settle for the first time in years. Rachel stood beside her, her hand on her shoulder, her presence a quiet promise. They didn't need to speak any more words. The note was everything. But as Vivian looked at her granddaughter, she felt a flicker of unease. She knew the call would come soon enough. The family would demand answers, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for that confrontation. But for now, in this moment, the silence between them was everything. Vivian sat in the old armchair by the window, the one Jack used to sit in, where the sunlight filtered through the curtains in the afternoons. It was the perfect spot for reflecting, for thinking, but today it felt more like a prison. The house was too quiet, too empty. Her fingers traced the edges of the fabric, worn soft by years of use, the memories laced in every thread. The doorbell rang, cutting through the stillness. Vivian sighed, knowing who it was before the knock even came. Stephen and Emily. They had a way of barging in, of thinking they could take control of everything, no matter how small or personal. "Mom, we need to talk," Stephen said as he stepped into the room, his voice almost too cheerful, too light, as if the conversation wasn't already predetermined in his mind. Vivian didn't answer right away. She simply stood, brushing past them to the kitchen where she started to fill the kettle with water. She knew what they were here for, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to hear it. "You'll love it," Stephen said, clearly impatient. "Less to clean. People your age." He paused, glancing at her pointedly. "You shouldn't be taking care of a house this big. It's too much." Vivian looked over at him, her gaze sharp. "I didn't give you authority to make decisions for me," she said quietly. The words felt strange, but they were the truth. It had been years since they had started acting as though they knew what was best for her. But today, it was different. She had made her own decisions, her own plans. Emily, always the one to smooth things over, walked in behind Stephen, her face drawn with concern. "We'll handle everything," she said gently, though the words came out like a rehearsed line. "It's time you let go. You can't keep living here alone. Vivian's fingers tightened around the edge of the counter. I didn't ask for your help, she said, her voice low but firm. I don't need your help. This is my home. But Emily wasn't deterred. Mom, we're just trying to make it easier for you. Her tone was soft, but there was an underlying command, a sense of urgency that made Vivian's chest tighten. We'll help you find a smaller place. You won't have to worry about anything. Vivian took a deep breath, the weight of their words pressing down on her. She turned away from them, the kettle now steaming beside her. I'm not going anywhere, she said, her back to them as she stood tall, feeling a surge of defiance she hadn't felt in a long time. But you might be. The silence that followed was thick, charged with unspoken words. Stephen's mouth opened, but he didn't speak. Emily blinked, her eyes searching Vivian's face, trying to gauge if she was joking or serious. She wasn't sure either, but in that moment, she knew what needed to be said, what needed to be done. Carol's words came back to her then, echoing through her mind as clearly as if she'd just heard them. Tell them what you told me. Vivian turned, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. I'm not moving, she said again, her words firm, like a boundary they could no longer ignore. This is my life, my decisions. Emily's face twisted with confusion, her brow furrowing as if she couldn't understand why her mother was fighting so hard. Why are you being so cold, she asked, her voice trembling slightly, though she tried to mask it with annoyance. Vivian met her gaze steadily. Cold? No, Emily, I'm not cold. I'm finally warm. Warm with my own choices, my own freedom. There was a finality in her tone, a calmness that startled even herself. For the first time in years, Vivian didn't feel the need to justify herself to them. The words felt right, the weight of them sinking into the air between them, hanging there like a question they were too afraid to answer. Stephen opened his mouth again, but the words seemed to get stuck, lodged somewhere deep inside. Finally, he shook his head, defeated, and turned to walk out. Emily followed him, but not before pausing to look back at Vivian, her expression softening ever so slightly. Mom, she said quietly, almost a whisper, we just want what's best for you. Vivian didn't answer. She didn't need to. The door clicked softly behind them, but the silence lingered in the house, heavier now. The kettle whistled in the background, and Vivian stood there for a moment, her chest tight, her thoughts racing. The house felt alive again, not with noise, but with the freedom to make her own choices. But she knew it wasn't over. Not yet. 2 years had passed since Stephen and Emily moved in temporarily, their promises of help and understanding now long forgotten. At first, it had been about convenience, about them needing a place to stay while they got on their feet. But now, the house that had once felt like a refuge to Vivian had become a constant reminder of everything she had lost. Her space, her freedom, her sense of self. She had given them everything she could, as she always had. But this was different. It was the quiet, invisible erosion of boundaries, things she had never spoken aloud, things they had simply taken for granted. And now, it was enough. Vivian sat at the kitchen table, the same one where they had always gathered for dinner, the one that had seen years of laughter, fights, and silence. It was here she had decided that this was the end. She was done. The legal notice lay before her, its bold black letters casting a shadow across the table. It was time to revoke their permissive occupancy. No more temporary. No more waiting for them to see what they had done. The doorbell rang, the sharp sound breaking her resolve for a brief moment. She stood up slowly, heart thudding in her chest. She knew who it was. Henry was at the door, the legal papers in his hand. He didn't need to say a word. He knew why he was here. The familiarity of the moment, of this kind of action, felt like the weight of years of unspoken tension finally finding its voice. He stepped inside, offering a quiet nod of understanding before heading straight for the kitchen table. Vivian's fingers tightened around the edge of the chair as he placed the envelope in front of her. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. This was it. The end of the line. The decision was made. Are you sure about this, Viv? Henry asked quietly, his voice soft but not judgmental. He had been with her through so much. and he could see the hesitation in her eyes, the weight of her final decision. Vivian looked up at him, her gaze steady. "I'm sure," she said simply. "They have to leave." Henry gave her a small smile of reassurance. "Then I'll take care of it, personally." A few hours later, the doorbell rang again, this time more impatient, more insistent. Vivian's heart sank, but she didn't hesitate. She stood up, moving toward the door, her mind already prepared for the confrontation. When she opened it, Stephen was standing there, eyes wide with a mix of confusion and anger. Emily stood behind him, her face pale, her hands clasped tightly together as if holding on to the last shred of whatever she thought she was entitled to. "What is this?" Stephen spat, holding up the envelope Henry had delivered. The legal papers crumpled in his fist. "You're breaking up the family over money." Vivian stood in the doorway, her posture unyielding. She had made her peace with the decision, but it didn't make it any easier to face them. "No," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I'm breaking it up over disrespect." Stephen's jaw tightened, his nostrils flaring with frustration. "You can't just kick us out," he growled. "We've been here for 2 years. You owe us more than this." Vivian felt the old familiar anger rise up in her chest, but she pushed it back, allowing the calmness to take over. "You've taken everything I've offered and given nothing in return. I've given you more than I had, and now it's time for you to go." The words hung in the air like an accusation, too heavy to ignore. Emily stepped forward, her face crumpling with emotion. "You'll die alone," she said, her voice breaking. "Is this what you want? To be alone? No one will care when you're gone." Vivian's eyes never left Emily's face. The words stung, but they didn't break her. She had been alone for a long time, in ways they couldn't understand. "I'll be fine," she said softly but firmly. "I don't need anyone to take care of me anymore." The silence that followed felt thick, suffocating. Stephen stood there, his hands clenched into fists, his eyes searching hers for some trace of softness, some crack in her resolve. But there was none. The door was already closing in their relationship. As the door clicked shut behind them, Vivian leaned against the frame, feeling the weight of the moment settle in her chest. She was free. But as the silence of the house swallowed her, she knew there was one more battle to fight. And this one would be the hardest. The house had never been quieter. The day Stephen and Emily left was a cold, sterile thing, more like a formality than a true farewell. They packed their things in silence, not a word of protest, no more excuses, no final arguments. They simply gathered their things and walked out. It took them exactly 30 days, as the notice required, but it felt like the weight of the years had been condensed into those 30 days. Vivian stood in the doorway as they left, her arms crossed, eyes steady. She didn't say goodbye. There was nothing left to say. When the door clicked shut behind them, it wasn't a release so much as an arrival. The house seemed to expand, the walls breathing for the first time in years, and she let herself feel the space, the freedom, the unspoken weight of the air that she could finally claim for herself. The first thing she did was turn their room into a reading space. She pulled up the worn carpet, swept out the dust, and painted the walls a soft shade of blue. Something soothing, something she could curl up in. The room, once full of unused promises and unasked for advice, now became a sanctuary. The shelves lined with books she hadn't read in years stood empty, and she filled them with the ones she had meant to read long ago. This was her space now. Carol came over the following weekend to help with the repainting. The sight of the new room, fresh and bright, brought a grin to Carol's face. "Looks like your house again," she said, stepping back to admire the transformation. There was a pride in her voice, something more than just the work of painting. Vivian nodded, the weight of her own words catching in her chest. "It does," she said softly. "It finally does." As the weeks passed, she began to find her rhythm again. She joined the community book club, something she had always meant to do but had never had the chance. The women were warm, welcoming, the conversations easy in their simplicity, a far cry from the tense silences that had filled her home for too long. She laughed with them over coffee, talked about books that felt like old friends, and for the first time in a long while, she felt like part of something again. One Sunday, after the book club meeting, she baked muffins for her new neighbors, the scent filling the house and making it feel alive. like it was hers, like she belonged here. The neighbors were polite, friendly, taking their muffins with smiles, and the simple exchange felt like a small victory, one of many. But it was Rachel who began to change everything. Rachel had always been there, in the background, quietly observing, and now she was more present than ever. She started, visiting weekly, her presence a quiet anchor that kept Vivian steady. She'd walk through the door with a warm smile, her voice filled with sincerity as she said, "I'd rather be here than anywhere." Vivian found herself looking forward to those visits. They'd sit in the sunroom, sip tea, and talk about everything and nothing. Rachel would share stories from school, and Vivian would listen, offering advice where needed. There was no rush, no time limit. It was just them, no expectations, just a space to exist side by side. Each visit felt like another stitch in the fabric of a new family, one that didn't demand anything from her, one that simply was. Rachel, who had been a quiet support in the background of Vivian's life, was now woven into its very center. The distance between them, once filled with obligations and regrets, had narrowed. Vivian sat with her that evening, the light fading outside the window, and for the first time in a long time, she felt complete. There was still work to be done, but the house, her house, felt like home again. And as Rachel set her cup down and smiled at her, Vivian realized that this was the family she had chosen. This was the future she had created, and it was worth every hard step she had taken to get here. But as the door to the sunroom closed behind them, something shifted in Vivian. She had learned that no matter how much she had given, there would always be more to discover about herself, about the people she chose to surround herself with. And somewhere, in the quiet space between Rachel's visits and the stillness of the house, she felt the pull of the next chapter. Vivian stood in the garden, the soil cool and fragrant beneath her fingers, the scent of fresh earth mingling with the soft scent of blooming roses. Her hands moved methodically, pulling weeds and smoothing the soil. It had become a routine, this ritual of planting and tending, a way to reconnect with herself after the storm had passed. The house had settled into a new rhythm, and so had she. It was the peace she'd fought for, and now it was hers. She didn't attend the court hearing. She didn't need to. The claim had been filed, but Vivian knew that nothing could alter what she had already set in motion. The legal battle, sparked by Stephen's insistence that the will had been invalid, was not hers to fight. Henry had taken care of it, had done what needed to be done. He had presented the airtight documentation, mental capacity, intent, and the clear trail of assets that showed no room for doubt. Vivian had never doubted for a moment that her decisions would stand, that her wishes would be respected. And when the court tossed the claim out, it was like a final exhale, a long-held breath that she had been holding since the moment the papers were signed. Henry had called, his voice low but confident. "It's over, Viv. They have no case. You're free." The words didn't carry the weight of victory, not for her. There was no joy in it, just finality. And so, she returned to her garden, the space where she could breathe deeply and feel the earth beneath her fingertips. In a way, the quiet of the garden had become her true victory, the place where the noise of the world couldn't reach her. The peace she'd always craved was finally here, rooted in the soil she tended with care. Carol arrived later that afternoon, a homemade cake in hand. Her footsteps were light as she approached, the sound of her voice carrying across the yard. "I thought we'd celebrate," Carol said with a smile, placing the cake gently on the table beside the garden. "Justice isn't loud, but it's sweet." Vivian smiled, but it was a quiet, tired smile. She appreciated the gesture, but the moment felt almost too heavy to fully embrace. She took a slow breath, the weight of it all settling in her chest. "Sweet," she murmured, "but I think I'm past celebrating." Carol nodded, understanding more than words could express. She didn't press Vivian further, but sat beside her in the silence, both of them letting the afternoon stretch out. It felt like the world was finally quiet, and that was enough. But then Rachel arrived, her face drawn with empathy. She stepped softly into the yard, her eyes meeting Vivian's with unspoken understanding. "I'm so sorry, Grandma," she said, her voice filled with sorrow. "This shouldn't have happened." Vivian looked at her granddaughter, her heart full. She knew Rachel didn't mean the legal battle. didn't mean the claim that had been tossed. Rachel meant the years of heartache, the years of being taken for granted, of being misunderstood. Vivian shook her head slowly, her voice calm and steady. "I'm not sorry," she said, her words firm. "I'm not sorry because I did what I had to do. I didn't ask for any of it, but now I've chosen the family I want." Rachel didn't answer right away. She just reached out, her hand gently resting on Vivian's. The gesture was enough. Vivian didn't need more words. She had what she needed in this moment. Later that evening, as the light dimmed in the garden and the last of the cake was finished, Vivian sat at the desk, a pen in her hand. It was time to make the changes official. She updated her trust, ensuring that Rachel was named as the full power of attorney. It felt like another step, another affirmation of the choices she had made. She would no longer be bound by the expectations of those who had never understood her, never respected her. Rachel, the one who had always seen her, would now carry that responsibility, her chosen family in full. The pen hovered for a moment, but then Vivian signed. Her choices were solidified, the path forward clear. And in the quiet of the house, as the evening settled around her, Vivian felt something stir deep inside, a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. But as the last ink dried on the page, she couldn't help but wonder, how long before the silence would be shattered again? How long before they would come back? The voicemail indicator blinked, its red light flashing like a warning. Vivian stood in the kitchen, hands wrapped around her coffee mug, the steam rising in gentle curls. She had no intention of listening to it, but her finger hovered over the play button. She didn't have to hear the voice to know who it was. Stephen, maybe Emily, or both of them. Asking, pleading, or perhaps demanding. She wasn't sure anymore. The beep sounded, and then Stephen's voice came through, sounding unfamiliar in its desperation. "Mom, we need to talk. Please just pick up. I'm not going to stop until you hear me out." Vivian closed her eyes for a moment, feeling a faint pulse of frustration run through her veins. She had heard it all before, the apologies, the justifications, the promises. But she had no more words left for them. No more patience for their needs or their manipulation. She didn't respond. Her thumb hit the delete button, and the message was gone. The silence that followed felt final, like a door closing that didn't need to be opened again. Later that morning, she sat on the porch, the same porch where she had spent so many mornings waiting for something to change, for someone to change. The sun was rising in slow, golden arcs, spilling over the trees and casting shadows across the yard. The world was waking up just as she had, in her own time, on her own terms. She felt the warmth of the sunlight on her skin, and for the first time in years, she felt like she could breathe without restraint. The phone sat beside her, silent and still, the inbox empty now. No more messages, no more demands. Instead, Vivian took the phone in her hand and opened up her banking app. She transferred a sum to the local literacy program, something she had always wanted to do but had never found the time for. She smiled as the confirmation flashed on the screen. It wasn't much, but it was hers to give, and it felt like an offering of hope for the future. Henry's call came later that afternoon, his voice steady but curious. "You've changed more than your will," he said, a hint of admiration in his tone. "You've changed your rules." Vivian leaned back in her chair, watching the birds flit from branch to branch. The world felt peaceful, almost unreal in its simplicity. "I had to," she said softly. "They needed to learn that I'm not the one who bends anymore. I've done that for too long." Henry chuckled, a knowing sound. "Well, they've learned it now. I'm sure they won't be back any time soon." Vivian didn't respond, but her heart swelled with something like relief. The weight that had hung over her for so long was finally lifting, piece by piece. Carol arrived with a pot of tea, her usual gift for the quiet moments they shared. As they sat together in the sunroom, the heat from the cup warming her hands, Carol looked at her with a mixture of pride and concern. "You taught them what no means," she said, her voice full of respect. "They never heard it from you before, not like this." Vivian's lips curled into a smile, but there was no joy in it, just a deep understanding of what it meant to finally take control. They've always assumed I'd say yes, she said, but I won't anymore. That evening, the community center's lights flickered on, and Vivian walked inside to the small classroom she had volunteered for, ready to teach her first budgeting class. It felt odd at first, standing in front of a room full of strangers, but the knowledge was hers to give. And the faces in front of her, curious, uncertain, eager, reminded her of something important. She wasn't just teaching them how to budget money. She was teaching them how to budget their time, their lives, their futures. As she began speaking, something stirred within her, a quiet power that had been dormant for too long. Vivian had finally learned how to say no, and she had learned it for herself. But perhaps in teaching others, she would teach herself something more, how to live fully, without the weight of others' expectations dragging her down. But as she turned to write on the chalkboard, a thought flashed through her mind. Could she ever be free of them completely? Or would they come back, demanding more? The answer, she realized, would be hers to make. The envelope sat on the kitchen table, its weight subtle but undeniable. Vivian watched it for a moment before taking a slow breath. It wasn't the check that mattered, not really. It was the name at the top of the check, the one she had carefully chosen for the fund she'd created, the Vivian Clark Resilience Fund. She had spent hours, weeks even, setting it up, ensuring it would be a legacy that would outlast her, a legacy of resilience, of choosing what you give and who you choose to give it to. She had always believed in Rachel, believed in her quiet strength, her ability to rise above circumstances. But this was more than just belief. This was an acknowledgement of Rachel's potential, her hard work, and most importantly, her unwavering presence in Vivian's life when no one else showed up. Vivian smiled to herself as she placed the envelope on the counter, the familiar creak of the floorboards beneath her feet grounding her. She was ready for this moment. This was the family she had chosen, the family she had built. Rachel had already shown her what mattered most. Now, Vivian was showing her the same thing. When Rachel arrived later that evening, her usual warmth filled the doorframe before she even stepped inside. "I brought some spinach dip," she said, grinning, her voice light as always. But when she saw the envelope on the table, her expression shifted, curiosity, then confusion, followed by a spark of recognition. "What's this?" Rachel asked, her voice gentle, but something else in her tone, an uncertainty perhaps, lingered. "Open it," Vivian said, her voice steady. She was already proud. She didn't need to say more. Rachel hesitated, and then carefully tore the envelope open. Her eyes scanned the check for a moment, disbelief creeping in. I don't know what to say," she said, her voice soft but full of emotion. Vivian leaned back in her chair, watching Rachel, the warmth of the moment settling deep in her chest. "You already did," she said with a small smile. "When you showed up." Rachel's eyes glistened, and she sat down next to Vivian, her hand resting on the table, fingers brushing over the check. "Grandma, I don't deserve this." Vivian shook her head, the simplicity of the moment filling her with more emotion than she had expected. "You do. You've worked for it. You've been there when I needed you, when no one else was. This is for you, for your future. You've already earned it." Rachel looked at her, the weight of her words settling into her, and then she simply nodded. Words weren't needed anymore. Instead, she reached for the recipe book, opening it to a favorite page they'd always cooked from. "Then let's cook," she said, a smile breaking across her face. They cooked together in the kitchen, chopping vegetables and stirring sauces, a dance of comfortable familiarity between them. It wasn't about the food. It was about the shared moments, the laughter, the simple joy of being together. As they sat down to eat, the meal felt different. It wasn't just dinner, it was a celebration of a future that was now open, wide and bright, with no shadows of doubt clouding it. The conversation flowed freely between them, Rachel recounting stories from her recent classes, Vivian offering advice, but mostly just listening, really listening. Later that evening, after Rachel had left, Vivian sat quietly at her desk, pen in hand. She updated her emergency contacts, her heart light as she typed. Only 2 names remained, Carol and Rachel. She had thought long and hard about this decision. It was a symbol, a representation of the choices she'd made. No more hollow expectations, No more obligation. Just the people who had earned the right to be there. Finally, she stood up and walked to the living room, her eyes catching the reflection of the sunlight on the new chair she had just purchased. It was simple, nothing extravagant, but it was hers. A small indulgence, but a significant one. She ran her fingers over the soft leather, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a deep sense of peace. She had chosen this. She had chosen herself, chosen Rachel, chosen Carol. She had made a life that was hers to live, without hesitation, without apology. But as she sat down in the chair, a quiet thought lingered in the back of her mind. How long before others would challenge her choices again? The thought didn't frighten her anymore, not like it used to. She was ready for whatever came next, and this time, no one would take it from her. Vivian sat in front of the fireplace, the room bathed in the soft, flickering light. The fire crackled, a familiar comfort that had become her companion in recent months. She stared at the letter in her hand for a long moment, the paper crisp and cool, its contents a reminder of everything she had left behind. It was from Stephen, another attempt to regain control, another desperate plea for reconciliation. Her fingers trembled for a moment, a ghost of hesitation crossing her mind, but she quickly banished it. She had made her choice. She had chosen herself, chosen Rachel, chosen peace. With a slow, deliberate motion, she crumpled the letter, watching as it folded into a small, insignificant thing, just like the promises that had been broken too many times before. The flames leapt higher, casting shadows on the walls, and she placed the paper into the fire. As it began to curl, then disintegrate into ash, she let out a slow breath, feeling the weight of the decision settle once more. Her gaze turned to the journal sitting beside her. She opened it to a blank page and with a steady hand wrote, "Regret is earned. So is peace." The words flowed easily, like a river she had been waiting to cross for years. This was hers, no one else's. The fire crackled again, the warmth filling the room as if confirming her truth. The house felt different now, filled with the sounds of her own life. It was quieter, yes, but also fuller. And when the doorbell rang a short while later, Vivian didn't hesitate. She stood up, her feet light against the floor, and opened the door to find Rachel standing on the porch, a pie in her hands and an excited glimmer in her eyes. "Grandma, I've got so many new stories," Rachel said, grinning as she stepped inside. The smell of the pie, freshly baked, mixed with the lavender that was just beginning to fill the air from the garden outside. The same scent that had been lost for so long was coming back, familiar, grounding. "Tell me everything," Vivian said, her voice soft but genuine. She led Rachel to the kitchen, where they set the pie on the counter. It wasn't just about the pie or the stories. It was about Rachel's presence, her steady, unyielding belief in her. They sat together, the kitchen filled with laughter as Rachel recounted her first few weeks of college. New friends, new professors, the excitement of learning and growing. Vivian listened intently, her heart swelling with pride. She had helped raise this young woman, but more than that, she had been there for her when no one else had. And Rachel had been there for her too, in a way she had never expected. As they ate the pie, Carol arrived, her usual energy filling the room. "Queen Vivian," she said with a wink, setting down her purse. The nickname had started as a joke, a playful tease, but now it felt like a badge of honor, one Vivian had earned without even realizing it. Carol moved to the counter, glancing at the pie and the remnants of their conversation. "You're smiling more than I've ever seen," she remarked, her eyes warm with affection. Vivian laughed, the sound light and genuine, echoing through the kitchen. For the first time in a long time, it didn't feel forced. She didn't have to pretend to be happy. She was happy. "Maybe it's because I'm finally free," Vivian said, glancing at the two women who had become the heart of her world. The house smelled like lavender, like the pie, and like something else too, something brighter, something stronger. It was the smell of a life that was truly hers, of a future that had opened up in front of her in ways she had never thought possible. As the evening wore on, the three of them sat together, talking, laughing, and simply being. There were no more ghosts of the past weighing her down. No more regrets she hadn't earned. She had made peace with herself. And now, surrounded by the people who had never asked her to be anything but herself, she could finally begin to live fully again. The sound of the clock ticking in the background seemed almost musical, a reminder that time, for once, was on her side. But as she glanced at the clock, something else flickered at the edge of her mind. Was there more waiting for her outside the walls of this peaceful life? Would her past come knocking again? She couldn't say for sure, but for the first time, it didn't matter, because no matter what came next, she was ready. The small auditorium buzzed with soft voices as the students in their graduation gowns filed in, their faces bright with excitement, each one preparing to step into the world with their own dreams. Rachel was no exception. Her posture was straight, her eyes alight with the pride of the moment. She was the first in her family to graduate, and Vivian's heart swelled as she watched her granddaughter take her place on the stage. As the ceremony progressed, Rachel stood in line, waiting for her moment. She hadn't seen it yet, but Vivian could already tell. She could tell by the way Rachel carried herself now, the quiet confidence that had come from years of hard work, from knowing she had earned every ounce of her success. Then came the moment, Rachel's turn to speak. She walked to the podium with a steady stride, her gaze scanning the room until it landed on Vivian, sitting near the front. A wave of emotion passed over her, but she didn't let it stop her. She cleared her throat, her voice strong and sure. "This is for the person who believed in me, when others only took." The words struck Vivian like a chord she hadn't known was there, resonating deep in her chest. She hadn't expected this, hadn't expected Rachel to speak these words, but they were the truth. She had spent so many years pouring herself into her family, giving without question, without expectation. And yet, Rachel had been the one to return that love. She had been the one to see, to understand, to care when no one else had. Vivian's eyes welled with tears, but she didn't wipe them away. She let them fall, silently, gently, because they were the tears of someone who had been seen, truly seen, for the first time in a long time. Carol, sitting beside her, squeezed her hand, her silent support filling the space between them. There were no words needed. No one else in that room could possibly understand the depth of what Rachel had just given her, what they had given each other. But Carol understood. She always had. The ceremony ended, and the crowd spilled out into the warm evening air. Rachel, radiant in her cap and gown, made her way toward Vivian and Carol. She practically glowed with pride, her smile wide and genuine. Vivian stood to meet her, her arms open, ready to embrace the girl who had given her the most important gift of all, believing in her when no one else had. They celebrated at a small cafe afterward, the three of them sharing a quiet, intimate moment of joy. Rachel beamed with pride, and Vivian couldn't help but feel a sense of peace settle in her chest. This moment was hers. It wasn't a grand, public celebration, but it didn't need to be. It was the quiet kind of victory, the kind that lasted beyond the applause. When the time came to say goodbye, Vivian reached into her purse, pulling out the small box that had been passed down from her mother. It wasn't valuable by the world's standards, but it was priceless in its meaning. The delicate ring inside had been worn by generations of women who had always chosen their own paths, their own lives, regardless of what the world demanded. Vivian held the ring out to Rachel. "It's not valuable," she said, her voice steady. "Just earned." Rachel's eyes widened, and she took the ring carefully, her fingers brushing Vivian's. It was the symbol of everything they had been through together, everything they had become. The bond between them wasn't defined by money or grand gestures. It was defined by moments like these. The hug they shared afterward felt like the closing of a chapter, but it wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. As Rachel pulled away, Vivian felt the weight of her own heart, full and content. There were no loose ends now, no regrets, only love. And as Rachel walked away, her future as bright as ever, Vivian knew that whatever came next, she was ready. She had finally found the stage she deserved. And it was hers, completely. Vivian sat at the kitchen table, the morning light spilling through the window and casting a soft glow across the papers in front of her. The house was quiet again, that peaceful hum of solitude that she had come to cherish. In her hands, she held a simple card, the kind one would find at a store for a graduation or an acknowledgement. The words written inside it, however, held more weight than any card she had ever received. I'm graduating because someone cared, someone who didn't know me. The card was from a student who had benefited from the Vivian Clark Resilience Fund, one of the many she had quietly helped over the years. The student had never met her, but her generosity had changed their life. They had written to her, their words filled with gratitude and quiet awe. In their message, they expressed how Vivian's fund had been the lifeline they needed to finish their education, how it had allowed them to rise when they thought they couldn't. Vivian smiled softly, a warmth spreading through her chest. This was the impact she had always hoped for, the kind that didn't need recognition, didn't ask for applause. It was enough. It was everything. She folded the card carefully, then placed it with her keepsakes, a small collection of memories that represented all she had given, all she had become. It wasn't much, but it was hers. The legacy she had crafted was quietly profound, and that was exactly how she wanted it. Vivian's gaze drifted to the blank pages of her journal, and an idea began to take shape. She picked up the pen, and the words came quickly, flowing as though they had always been there, waiting to be written. Owed nothing, gave everything. It was the title of a short memoir, one that she had put off for so long, always too busy, too involved in the day-to-day of living. But now, as she sat at her desk, she realized that her story needed to be told. Not for fame, not for recognition, but for herself. For the people like Rachel, like Carol, who had seen her, who had understood her when no one else had. Carol walked in just as she was finishing the first few sentences, her eyes sparkling with that familiar energy. She leaned against the doorframe and smiled. People are going to cry reading this, she said, her voice warm, full of affection. Vivian paused, considering the words for a moment. Let them, she replied, her voice steady. Let them cry, it's the truth. The doorbell rang a moment later, but it was just a text message that pinged on Vivian's phone. She picked it up, seeing Rachel's name on the screen. I'm coming home this weekend, just to sit with you. Vivian's heart lifted, her chest tight with love and pride. Rachel's presence had always been a quiet anchor in her life, and now, more than ever, it was exactly what Vivian needed. She set the phone down and turned back to her journal. The words had already begun to take shape, like a story she had been writing her whole life without realizing it. It wasn't a grand tale, not one that would change the world, but it was hers. And that, for the first time, was enough. Vivian stood in front of the vase, the fresh flowers still vibrant with color, their scent rich and sweet. The card that accompanied them, another gesture from Stephen, another hollow attempt to pull her back into the fold, lay discarded on the counter. She had read it briefly, a tired apology, asking for forgiveness, a promise to make things right. But it wasn't new. It wasn't different from the many others she had received over the years. She didn't need to keep it. She tossed the card into the trash, watching it settle in with the other discarded memories. But the vase, she kept the vase. The flowers were beautiful, and for the first time, they weren't a symbol of guilt or obligation. They were a symbol of something else, peace. She had earned the right to accept that peace, to accept beauty without the price of emotional manipulation. The scent of the flowers lingered in the air as she turned back to her desk, her fingers brushing over the pages of her memoir. The words had come easily, and now the final line was before her. She lifted the pen and wrote the last words. Some debts are blessings unpaid. She paused, the words settling in her heart. This was the truth. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about what had been taken or given. It was about the choice to release, to no longer carry what wasn't hers to bear. Vivian smiled softly to herself, the weight lifting off her shoulders for the last time. She closed the journal with a sense of finality. Her story was written, her peace was made, and no one else could take it from her. The doorbell rang, and before she could even reach for the doorknob, Rachel's voice filled the air. Grandma, I'm here. Vivian turned, her heart swelling as Rachel stepped into the doorway. No agenda, no demands, just arms open, ready to embrace her, just as always. It was the simplicity of it that meant the most. Rachel's presence, steady and warm, had been the one constant through it all. Come on in, Vivian said, her voice soft and welcoming, as if inviting her into the sanctuary she had built for herself. They walked out to the porch, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows on the lawn. It was a perfect evening, the kind of evening that felt like a sigh of relief, like the world had slowed down long enough to let them just be. They sat in the old rocking chairs, the same ones that had rocked countless memories into the past. The smell of fresh-cut grass and the faintest hint of lavender filled the air, and for the first time in ages, the world felt right. Rachel handed her a glass of lemonade, and they sat in comfortable silence for a while, letting the evening unfold without words. Just the sound of the breeze rustling the leaves, the soft clink of ice in their glasses, and the quiet hum of life going on around them. A few minutes later, Carol arrived, as energetic as always, carrying a plate of lemon bars. "I thought these would go well with your lemonade," she said with a wink, setting them down on the table between them. Vivian laughed softly, her heart full. There was no drama, no chaos, just peace, just the simple joy of being together. They ate the lemon bars, their tangy sweetness filling the quiet spaces between their conversations. Vivian looked at Rachel, then at Carol, the weight of everything finally settling into place. For the first time in a long time, the world felt like it was in balance. As the sun dipped lower, casting golden light across the porch, Vivian took a deep breath, the peace of the moment settling into her bones. The air felt cool against her skin, and for the first time in a long while, she felt like she had everything she needed. She exhaled, and the final line of her memoir echoed in her mind once more. When my son said, "You owe us everything," I agreed, and paid them exactly that. Nothing. The words didn't feel bitter. They didn't feel angry. They simply felt true. And as the three of them sat on the porch, the world around them quiet and still, Vivian realized that she had finally found the peace she had been searching for all along. No more apologies, no more debts, no more expectations. Just love. Just life. And no one could take that from her.